know it's nice and toasty in here, so we'll have to do our best to stay cool. I have a hunch we'll have to get used to that for the remainder of the semester on a sunny day, because this room has the exposures that it's going to get warm. But we'll do our best. So let's get started. I first wanted to find out from you all, and this is a sincere question, so please give me your sincere answers. Did you find the make-up videos useful? The TED-Ed screencast, which I know you're used to the technology, but also I'm interested in the Lexis Learn modules. It's obviously not something I put together, and I haven't used that in the past. I was actually going to use it in class last week, but when that didn't work out, I figured let me give it to you. So did you find them useful as makeups? Did you get a sense, especially I'm concerned of the material regarding citators, because of course that's going to be on the assignment, which I emailed you about last week, and here's a paper copy if you like paper copies. Any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, I really like the Lexis one. I think I liked it even more than the TED Talks, just because sometimes the TED education, sometimes the audio isn't great, and I also like the hypothetical too.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I actually do those recordings for the TED. They're not real TED Talks, they're just me recording. Yeah, okay. And because of the technology, I know the audio isn't great. Sounds like you're underwater. I actually just learned about a new technology for recording that I'm going to try out. It's not going to help us, unfortunately, but I am aware of that. But thanks for mentioning. Yeah?
I didn't like Lexis, actually.
Okay.
Just doing it, it wasn't giving me anything positive. I just kind of sat there like, all right, actually doing the questions, but the TED Talks I like.
Okay. Okay, fair enough. Good to know. Any other thoughts? It sounds like this is something I will think about continuing as we go along. The other thing, a couple of housekeeping items. Just an FYI, since we weren't here last week, I just wanted to remind you that we are staying on the same schedule with the assignments. So our next assignment 4 on cases will be due next week. Some of you have already started asking questions, which is great. The other housekeeping item, I wanted to mention, came up in conversation actually just before class, and that had to do with Lexis Bloomberg and Westlaw access for you after you graduate. Pardon me?
Yes.
And the answer is actually mostly yes. I have up on the screen actually this is a web page to remind librarians how to answer that question. So the answer is for Bloomberg, you basically have access for 6 months after graduation with no restrictions. And you don't need to do anything to make that happen. It just is. So you can continue to play on Bloomberg and complain about it for the next 6 months anyway. Lexis graduates can access through December. Well, that date is old, but basically it is the same for this year through December. And you want to make sure to redeem any points. Westlaw, as usual, is a little more complicated. You need to extend it. I think you all probably got emails to that effect from what I gather. And you can extend, and your access will last through the end of November. Again, that date is wrong, but it is still the same concept. Okay. So today, we dived into administrative materials, and yes, this is indeed a handout not produced by me, as you can tell, but we'll be going through it. I'm glad some of you find it kind of fun. I was hoping that would be the case. So let's put this in context of where we are with regard to primary sources. So we've talked about the legislative branch. We just finished up talking about the judicial branch. So now we are going to dive into the executive branch. And our sources chart off the screen there actually does not represent all of the administrative materials that are produced by the executive branch. As it is labeled, it says regulations. As I'm sure you've all heard by now, there are other executive materials such as executive orders, right? We've been hearing a lot about that, as well as presidential memoranda. All of these have been in the news of late, and we will be talking about them. So just to make you aware, there's actually another aspect of executive or administrative material, that's not listed here, and that's agency decisions. And we'll be talking about all of those throughout the day. I sort of suspect that we will not get through all of this today, which is going to be perfectly fine because I've left time for next week when we will continue whatever we don't finish today, as well as pick up on state administrative materials if we don't get to it today. Okay, so that is essentially putting it in context of primary materials. So these different type of administrative materials, we'll be talking first about regulations. Regulations issued by, or rather delegated from Congress to the executive branch, to the various agencies, and then published, as we'll talk about. There are also these, what are sometimes referred to as quasi-judicial decisions. These are decisions not made by judges in courts, but made by what are known as administrative law judges working for the various agencies. And so these are essentially when somebody says, hey, that agency didn't apply the rule right. As you may remember from administrative law, if they have a controversy, if they have a dispute, the first step of that dispute sometimes is actually the administrative agency itself, which will hear the dispute and issue an administrative decision. Already talked a little bit about executive documents, and as I said, we'll be talking more about it in a little while, or perhaps next week. So why is it, how is it that agencies can issue these regulations? Well, one of the reasons I gave you this kind of fun, I hope, chart is it starts, and it seems like this is pretty simplistic, but again, like our I'm Just a Bill video, it actually has a lot of content in there. So here in step one, of course, Congress passes the laws, and then essentially what Congress will frequently do in very technical areas and more in lots of areas is to say, okay, we are not experts on the environment. We are not experts in tax. We are not experts in ERISA law. We're going to say, hey, Department of Labor, hey, Internal Revenue Service, hey, Environmental Protection Agency, you go figure out the details on how to implement the laws we pass. So figure out how many parts per billion of arsenic there can be in water and still be safe under the Clean Air Act. Figure out how many parts per billion of carbon dioxide is okay to have in the air before we have to start to worry about all the various different things we worry about with regard to air pollution, again, pursuant to the Clean Air Act. So essentially what the agencies have are delegated authority. What makes this worth spending some time on right now is that this can be an area of controversy and an area that can be disputed. And I give you examples of that, somewhat older examples of that. There will probably be lots of new ones in the courts coming through over the next several months. But these are examples from last year, having to do with then President Obama's Clean Power Plan. You can see from the news article I had you pick up. So essentially what interested parties do, so as you can imagine, if President Obama at the time issued a Clean Power Plan, there are going to be power plants that might object to this because they don't want to be subject to stricter regulations. So interested parties bring it to court and say, hey, agency, you overstepped your authority. The authority that Congress delegated to you in the statute, whatever statute, authorizing statute that is, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act in this case, the people disputing this regulation say the agency didn't have the authority to issue this. So when you're dealing with regulations, that is always a possibility, whether you are on the side of supporting that regulation and thinking, hey, this is a great idea. So you want to be aware of that challenge, or you're only to hit this regulation, we want to dispute it. The authority of the agency to issue that regulation under the authorizing statute may be one way to do that. And you can see how that played out in the courts. So we turn to page 3 of the article. One example where this article is referring back actually a couple of years ago to upholding the greenhouse gas rules, basically saying here's an instance with the greenhouse gas rules where the court upheld the agency's authority to issue those rules. But in the first instance, in the case that the article was first talking about, the court actually suspended the rules basically for further investigation as to whether the agency had the authority to issue those rules. So again, just emphasizing the concept of delegated authority, and you can see that again on this other article, again regarding EPA regulations. Any questions about delegated authority? Okay, so to give you, that's what I gave you in what you see on our nice colorful Ben's Guide handout, sort of the theory, to give you an idea of the perception of the practice, because I haven't done it in a while, and actually I think this is a kind of interesting portrayal of how this can work in practice. Is, again, I still miss him terribly, John Stewart. And you'll see another familiar face there too. So the technology is smiling upon us. Let's see if we can get this started.
Now, with the standoff in our nation's capital over the debt ceiling showing us nothing but bitter stalemate, it's easy to forget that it was just 1 year ago that Washington actually got something done. The Dodd-Frank Act, a complete overhaul of the regulations governing our financial system, intended to ensure that we would never again suffer another 2008-style meltdown.
These reforms represent the strongest consumer financial protections in history. And these protections will be enforced by a new consumer watchdog with just one job: looking out for people, not big banks, not lenders, not investment houses, looking out for people.
What? Wait, who? Who were we looking out for before? Anyway, the Dodd-Frank Act is now 1 year old. Here to discuss the effect it's having in reforming a damaged financial system, we're very lucky to have with us tonight H.R. 4173, the Dodd-Frank Act, everybody!
Cartoon look a little familiar? And Cokie looks familiar.
A 2,000-page law. Congress passed me without one single flaw. I make sure Wall Street plays by the new regulations, protecting your investments across the entire nation.
Just hang on there 1 second.
What?
I'm sorry, Dodd-Frank.
Uh-huh. What?
What the hell happened to you?
What do you mean?
I don't want to say it, but you look like...
Oh, hey, easy. Washington's a tough town, John. Since getting past, yeah, I've taken a few shots, but I'm still standing. Yeah, yes, I'm still standing. I'm still here. In fact, just last week, my all-new Consumer Financial Protection Board opened for business. As soon as it gets a director, we'll be off to the races.
There's no director?
No, not just yet.
It's been a year.
Come on.
What about Elizabeth Warren? Wasn't she supposed to be the director of this thing? What happened there?
Confirmation in the Senate, there's no motion. Obama couldn't use a recess appointment to give her the job without her vote, but he didn't do it because his feelings weren't that strong.
Wow.
You know what?
That's interesting.
You know what, John? It doesn't matter. I've still got 400 tough new rules to remake our broken and corrupt financial system.
Well, you know what? That's great. How are those new 400 rules working?
They're working great. The ones that are written are working great.
The ones that are... How many of the 400 new rules have been written?
38. It's a magic number. Yes, it is. Oh, it's a magic number. It might not be 400 or 150 or 77, but it's 38. And that's a magic number. Let's do this. Red Sox pitcher Kurt Schilling. And LA Clippers forward Dale Wilson. Cardinals tailback Ricky Rivers. They want 38. And it's a magic number. Oh, it's a magic number.
I'm sorry, but 38 Is a magic number because Dale Wilkinson
Yeah.
makes it a magic
Yeah,
number?
you've heard of Dale Wilkinson?
No, I have not.
Oh.
Clippers guy, until you mentioned him just now. No, I have not
You'll
heard.
just have to take my word for it. He definitely exists.
Why weren't the rules written, John?
Stigley. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, 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 get your access here. Lobby, lobby, that's your stop. Here's what's going down. This whole fun.
Okay. So, as you can tell, a little bit dated, right? That was back in 2010 when Dodd-Frank first passed, although interestingly that has become an issue again, not only the regulations that ultimately did get promulgated, more than just the 38, but the fact that the Consumer Financial Protection Board that finally did get a director, Richard Cordray, is now being considered possibly to be somehow dismantled, although that probably would have to be more of a congressional action. But I enjoy that video. In addition to it being fun and funny, I think, it gives you the sense of how the process works a little more realistically, that it's not just quite our very cute friends here working their way up the process, that there are a lot of complicating factors. And again, the interplay between Congress and the agencies as well, as the confirmation process, etc. Okay, so we have an overall sense, I hope, of where regulations fit into the scheme of primary sources, and hopefully a good sense of why we care. Again, they are primary source of the law, and these are the delegated authority from Congress that are very much, that need to be abided by very much as statutes do. So let's dive in and take a look at basically how we find them and get a little bit more familiar with what the different components are, because I think that will help us both find them as well as understand them. They're always important, right? So I'm going to look first, or we're going to look first, I hope, basically at, of course, finding regulations, because when you're doing research, you want to be able to find the materials. And there are pretty much, by now, we know the different methods for finding primary sources. So what are the methods we know so far? Best place to start research is secondary sources, and secondary sources explain as well as give us reference to the all-important primary sources. So you will frequently find regulatory references in secondary sources. Where's another place to find references that is in and of itself a primary source? Annotated code, your very best, your BFF helps you find cases, may also help you find regulations. So let's take a quick look. As you can see, I have one of our sections that we've been talking about a little bit less, 1132 in the U.S. Code Annotated. So here on Westlaw, now this you will not always find a regulatory reference in a statutory code. And by the way, I'm showing you federal now. I will show you state when we get there, either later today or next week. But it works the same way. So here in context and analysis, basically one of the sections, if it is there, and as I said, it's not always there, will be, voila, Code of Federal Regulations. So a couple of caveats. One I just gave you won't always find a regulatory reference from an annotated code. And second, if you do find one, it may or may not be the best reference or even very relevant. But so why it's useful is, of course, if it is relevant, you want to check it out. But even if it isn't the best reference, it will likely get you at least into the right title of the administrative code. So the administrative code on the federal end is called the CFR, and we'll be talking a lot more about it in just a moment. So it'll at least get you in the right title of the CFR and possibly within the right area. And we'll talk about part and subparts of the CFR in just a moment. So even if this particular citation, 2570.1, is not a particularly good section, I'm going to take a look at those sections around 2570.1 to see if they are interesting. Likewise, this reference and this reference. And it works pretty much the same way here on Lexis. Except instead of going to context and analysis, of course, our equivalent on Lexis is research reference aid, and sure enough, if you have it, Code of Federal Regulations, and again, you see those references here. And it's actually worth looking at on Bloomberg. I don't have that up quite yet, so let's see. So Bloomberg really, because it's not as good an annotated code, doesn't really have those references. Okay, and of course, the way that most people want to start when they're looking for any kind of source on a subject is keyword searching, right? You're going to dive in on whatever your favorite service is, maybe Google search first, which actually might up too, but then take a look on Lexis or Westlaw, and let's see if I can pull it up quickly in my history, and if not, there we go. So just to save a little bit typing, so I did one of our favorite searches, ERISA and preemption, and of course what you see here in a keyword search, I already have it highlighted for regulations. But you see our standard filters on the side. We've been looking at statutes and, of course, cases, secondary sources. So, of course, there's regulations. And notice regulations are separated out from administrative decisions and guidance. So regulations will be, again, those the rules that are the delegated authority from Congress to the agency, and the agency issues the rules. And what that looks like on Lexis. Let's see if I can pull that up. Searches, preemption. How nice. And similarly, divided up somewhat differently and not in any order that I can figure out. Again, administrative materials are separate from administrative codes and regulations. So if you're looking for regulations, just again, the bibliographic awareness, be aware of where you're looking at. And what is kind of interesting, I think, on Bloomberg, because I think it helps explain the division of the different types of materials, is what Bloomberg does. We have a heading here, regulatory administrative materials, and it gives us a whole bunch of different types, so you really get a sense of the different aspects of administrative materials. So their initial filings, there's guidance and interpretation, pretty much what it sounds like. Agency gives you guidance in its particular area. We'll be looking at some of this later on. The rules, basically the rules that we'll be looking at in just a moment in the CFR, and those orders and decisions, and then there are these. Actually, I'm sorry, orders and decisions are administrative. Those decisions I talked about from the administrative law judge. Excuse me, I misspoke. So again, you have to keep track and pay attention. And the codified regulations are the regulations issued by the agencies that we'll find in the CFR. So again, I pulled this out so you can see the different types of administrative materials. Okay, see the problem with in terms of any questions? Keyword searching is great, but as we discovered with statutes, statutes use pretty specialized language, so you don't necessarily always pull up the most relevant statute. Even when you have good keywords, it's even more true with regard to the CFR, because we're talking about very specialized areas where, again, I gave you the example earlier, parts per billion of arsenic, and those may not even be good search terms in order to find that information in the CFR. So keyword searching is going to be even more problematic than even we talked about with statutes. So I would say secondary sources are going to be your best bet. Possibly references, I mentioned references in the annotated code, are going to be inconsistent. What's really going to be not just your BFF, your best friend, but absolutely essential with the Code of Federal Regulations is going to be the table of contents. And I would say, with regard to when you are looking at regulations, however you get a reference, whether it's through a secondary source or a keyword search or a Google search, however it is, make sure when you find something that looks even maybe not very relevant, but in the right ballpark, and I'm being broad, using the word ballpark, as a pretty big place, check out that section and look at the table of contents. So we did our ERISA preemption search on Lexis, and I'm going to go to the first result, labor employee welfare benefit plan. So again, I'm not sure how relevant that is, but I am going to go there and give you, hopefully, convince you why the table of contents is just so necessary. So we can do it a couple of ways, as you already know on Lexis. I'm going to pull it out using the heading information. And what I try to do is to find the broadest area that still is, it's all going to be relevant, but I try to find the broadest area, but that's still going to cover my issue. So obviously labor is really broad, and there are going to be a whole lot of other issues covered there that aren't going to be relevant. Regulations pertaining to labor. Likewise, we're going to talk about a whole lot of other areas. But check this out. Employee Benefits Security Administrative Department of Labor. So employee benefits, that sounds like that's going to be the broadest area. Now, you may not, obviously I checked this out earlier so I know what the answer is, so you may not get it right the first time, but remember, looking at the table of contents, easy enough, and also for those concerned about it, actually doesn't cost anything. So let's look at the table of contents. So basically we're looking at chapter 25, that XX5 is just the Roman numeral, under title 29 of the CFR. And honestly, what I would do with the table of contents is I'm just going to go through and check out each one. So under general, because we know, who knows what's going to be under general. So notice we have chapter 25, and then we have subchapter A, and then below the subchapter we have part 2509, interpretive bulletins relating. I'm going to save that for later if at all that doesn't sound particularly promising. Oh, definitions, subchapter B. Definitely going to look at definitions. So part 2510, definition of terms used in all of these different subchapters. And again, this wasn't, 2510 was not a reference we got from the annotated code. Maybe we found it elsewhere. It wasn't actually the link I took from our ERISA preemption search, but in going to the table of contents, I found these definitions. And here I see the actual sections where I will get different definitions. So notice, we are in part 2510, and notice the section number, 2510.3-1, 2510.3-2. So if I am getting a section number reference from wherever I'm looking, I already know the part I want to look at in the table of contents. I want to look at part 2510. Now I may want to look at, I will almost certainly want to look at other parts too. So you see the process. I'm not going to go through all these subchapters because that'll take a lot of time, but we might, in scanning through quickly, fiduciary responsibility, that was a possible theory of liability we could use on behalf of our client, so we might want to take a look at rules and regulations there. And in the course of our secondary research, we ran across the phrase group health plans that turned out to be applicable. So we might want to look there, and under Part 2590, what we finally notice as we expand, and sometimes you look at these subparts and you don't know what the heading is, so you take a look, and only by taking a look do I expand and do I find preemption. Now this section may or may not apply to us, but we certainly want to find it and make that determination. And if we take a look at our Lexis Westlaw Bloomberg results, this particular section, Title 29 CFR, Section 2590.731, doesn't come up high up. We only would discover it going through the table of contents. So I really can't emphasize enough. Again, if the annotated code is your BFF, table of contents and regulations is totally, absolutely mandatory and crucial. So another red star, underline, bold letters in your notes if you take them that way. Okay, and of course you can do this on actually Bloomberg as well as Westlaw as well, and we will be looking at 3 sources of the CFR in just a little while. Okay, so let's get to know the publication, the CFR itself, and how regulations are published a little bit better. And for that, I'm going to go back to our sources handout, because we didn't really go over the details. So in the administrative branch, we start out with the chronological publication of regulations and executive actions, and that appears in something called the Federal Register for the federal, and actually also a register in the state level. Again, we'll review the state later on. And then we have, again, a subject compilation, which we've already talked about a little bit, Code of Federal Regulations. And that's abbreviated CFR. So, does this pattern, chronological publication to subject compilation, remind you of anything we've just talked about? Not today, but a few weeks ago. Hint, hint. So same concept. You have your chronological publication, and then you have your code, which is subject arranged. The Federal Register is actually published every day. So, and you find the Federal Register. You can find it by citation, but most people typically find it by date. Okay, and just again, we'll get into more detail when we talk about states, but the names are somewhat similar. You've got the New York State Register, where you find it's not daily, it's the weekly publication of what happens in the agencies, and then that's codified, put in subject arrangement, and it's called this Field Compilation of Codes, Rules, and Regulations of the State of New York, NYCRR, which is actually a confusing abbreviation. I think I mentioned this before because sometimes people think that stands for New York City. It's actually New York Code. Again, sometimes understanding the abbreviations are the key to understanding a lot of what the area is like and how to do research. Questions? So back at the CFR, looking at our table of contents, what we see is, so here's the table of contents of the entire Code of Federal Regulations, and we see it's got titles just like the U.S. Code. And some of those titles actually are the same. So we were just looking at Title 29, and sure enough, Title 29 in U.S. Code is the labor title, and Title 29 in the CFR is the label title. How nice. Bill, I'm sure you know Title 26 very well in both the U.S. Code and the CFR. Internal Revenue Code in the U.S. Code, Internal Revenue Service in the CFR. However, that doesn't work out for all 50 titles. Actually, there are 50 titles still in the CFR. There are now 54 in the U.S. Code, so obviously that doesn't work out. And one difference I happen to notice, and there are plenty others, is you've got federal elections as Title 11 in the CFR, and I'm pretty sure Title 11 in the U.S. Code is bankruptcy. So don't expect the titles to be the same. be aware when they are, because then that helps you identify stuff, but it isn't always the case. Okay, so let's take a look at our walkthrough, and these pages are on the handouts link on the website if you'd like to look at it that way. And actually, I skipped the first couple of pages, so let's backtrack just a little bit. So on pages 1 and 2, what you see, and this is probably not something you'll use, but I put it in here again to help you understand the concept of delegated authority. So on page 1, it explains what we're looking at, the parallel table of authorities and roles. And page 2 is actually that table. And again, you can see the authority from the U.S. Code and what CFR section that U.S. Code, where that authority comes from for the Code of Federal Regulations. So to say that a hopefully more clear way, here in the table under the U.S. Code, Section 1132, if you read through Section 1132 of the U.S. Code, that would authorize regulations that appear in these parts of the CFR. So Titles 29, Parts 2560, 2570, 2571. You'll notice the other section of the U.S. Code we've been talking about, 1144, isn't listed here. That just means that it hasn't authorized any regulations to be issued in the CFR. So if you were looking at a U.S. Code section and wondering, I'm wondering what regulations pertain to this, this would be one way to find that out. Not the best way, honestly. We've talked about other better ways, I think. But you get us if you are thinking about, okay, does the agency really have authority to do this? So the first thing you want to look is into the U.S. Code, into the statute that authorized the agency to promulgate these rules. And this table would be one place to find it. You find it lots of other places too. Again, I'm showing you this just to give you a sense of how the delegation looks practically within the publications. Turning to page 3, in terms of back to our discussion of finding regulations. So we talked about secondary sources, we talked about the annotated code, we talked about how important the table of contents is. The CFR does in fact have an index. You can find it on Lexis and Westlaw as well. Here it is in print. It's again hit or miss because you have to find the right terms. Again, I think the nice thing about an index is at least if I get started with some terms, it might give me ideas of others. So looking under Employee Retirement Income Security Act spelled out, it refers me to pensions. If I might not look at pensions first, right, because we're worried about health benefits, not pension benefits. But I'm looking under P in the index for pensions. And again, this would work the same online. Scanning down, I would see, again, Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and then under that heading, I might pick up that, oh, group health plans, I've seen that before, maybe I want to take a look at that section also. Again, different tools. I would say I would probably not start with the index with the CFR. I would probably start, hopefully, with a reference from a secondary source or elsewhere. I would then probably go to a keyword search, and I'll show you where you can do searching for free in the CFR if you don't want to incur the expense online. And then I'll go to the table of contents. If my keyword searches weren't working, then I might go to the index to get some help with terminology because I'm just not thinking of the right words. Okay, any questions? So let's dive into the CFR and get to know it a little bit better, up close and personal, as they say on some of the sportscasts. And again, this works the same online. We will take a look online in just a moment so you can see how it translates. So we are looking at Title 29, again in print, the CFR. And some of you might notice that the book is blue, and some of you might notice that it says here on the page revised as of July 1, 2016. We will come back to that. And as we saw online, and actually it's much easier to find online, I think, the table of contents, again, absolutely crucial to check when you're doing regulatory research. And we would discover, scanning Title 29, that Chapter 25, Employee Benefits, looks promising. And then on page 7, we would see Chapter 25. And I happen to think, actually, I can see the parts listed out a little bit easier in the print, but obviously whatever you have available will do the job. So we can see Part 2510, the definition, turning the page to page 8. We see Part 2590. And you want to keep that terminology in mind because that part is referred to when you're using the CFR. So you've got Title 29, the labor title in the CFR, and then the part number will typically be the next designation. So let's see what on earth I mean by this part stuff. So turning to page 9, I'm actually looking at Part 2510 instead of 2590. We'll look at 2590 in a moment. So Part 2510, as we saw before in the table of contents, is the definitions of terms used in these various subchapters. And within 2510, we see these various section numbers. And again, 2510 indicates what part, and then the section, period, and then whatever section it is. So 3-1, 3-2, and so forth. What we then see, and this is important, again, going back to that whole concept of authority, is the CFR will tell us what the authority is for that particular part, for the overall part when it was initially promulgated. So we can see here on page 9, the authority for all of the sections in Part 2510, or at least 2510 as it was initially promulgated, can be found in Title 29 of the U.S. Code and these various sections that are listed here. So that's the other way, rather than that table, which is hard to find and a little bit confusing. If you're looking at a particular regulation, you can go to the part to find the authority, is one place you would find that. Okay, so turning to page 10, let's take a look at a part that's a little more involved, which you will frequently encounter when dealing, especially in federal regulations, but state regulations also, because these areas of law that have regulations tend to be more complex. So here's Part 2590 that we were looking at earlier. And we see the whole table of contents, and we can scan down, and again we see all of the sections in Part 2590 start with the number 2590 point, and then whatever section number, 606, 715, whatever section you see here. And then after the table of contents of Part 2590, we see, again, the authority. So we see this Part 2590 as it was authorized by these different U.S. Code sections. So again, if you think that the agency has exceeded its authority, take a look at the part and the section that you're interested in and find the authority. So here are the list of the different USC sections. So below the authority, we then see something called the source. And what the source is telling us is where in the Federal Register this part was promulgated as a final regulation. So if we go back to our lovely Ben's Guide, a nice colorful handout, this is essentially the regulatory process. You learn this in administrative law, right? Where the agency proposes the rule, and I'm oversimplifying again, it then is open for comment. There has to be notice of the rule, then people, interested parties can submit comments. Then the agency looks through all those comments and then issues the final rule. That final rule is what appears in the CFR. And what the source is telling us is where in the federal, and all of that process, much of that process that I describe appears in the Federal Register. We'll look in the Federal Register in just a little bit. But where the final rule applies is what you see as the source in the CFR. Why you care might be a good question. And the answer to that is if you need to trace back what the agency considered when it promulgated the final rule. Does that sound familiar to anything we've talked about? Why the agency promulgated the rule, issued the final rule as it did? How about if I ask what the agency's intent was? Legislative history, excellent. So instead, what the Federal Register will do for us is give us regulatory history. And we'll be looking at that shortly. So that's what the source tells us. Okay, so let's turn the page to 11. And one of the sections in the table of contents, had we scanned through looking for what might be relevant to us and our client, section 2590.715-2719, internal claims and appeals and external review process. So one thing we might want to do is find out from our client exactly what process she went through, if there were any appeals, what sort of external review, and check here in the CFR and see what's required. Make sure that that process as our client went through was the required process as we see here in the CFR. Turning the page to page 12, we also see within that same section minimum internal claims and appeals standards. So there are standards that these appeals, internal claims and appeals must adhere to, and again, so this again might be relevant. So giving you a sense of the level of detail you'll find in the regulations, why looking through them is so important, why going through that table of contents to help you find relevant sections is so important. Turning to page 13, at the end of the section we're looking at, 2590.715-2719A, we see at the end another parenthetical with an FR site. Think of that kind of as the credit like we see in statutes. That's again telling you where in the Federal Register this particular section was promulgated as a final rule. Go back a moment to page 10. Remember on page 10 we saw the authority for Part 2590 and we saw the source. And we talked a lot about the source, and the source tells us that originally Part 2590 was promulgated in volume 62 Federal Register 16, oh my goodness, 941. My eyes aren't as good as they used to be. Everybody see where I am? Did I get that number right? Like I said, print's getting tough to read. And that was, so Part 2590 was originally promulgated as final rules on April 8, 1997. And then it tells us, unless otherwise noted. So going back now to page, make sure I get this right, 13. So we look through our section 715-2719A, and at the end, that sort of credit-like parenthetical, that's what they mean by otherwise noted. So this particular section doesn't have the same source as does some of the other sections in Part 2590. This has a different source. Notice it's later in time. It's 80 FR 72264, is that right? That number? I'm reading it right, and it's on November 18th, 2015, so it's a whole lot later. It's almost 20 years later. So it's still promulgated, so that part basically got a new section later on because something new happened, and I believe, don't quote me on this, that this particular section was promulgated after the Affordable Care Act. So this is implementing the Affordable Care Act. It'll be interesting to see what happens to this, if I'm right, what happens to this section if the Affordable Care Act gets changed. Which is they're talking about a lot in the news these days. Okay, so do you understand the source for the part as well as the source for the particular section if it's different? If you don't see a source after a section, that just means it's the same source as the rest of the part. If it is different, then obviously that's what it is. And actually, interestingly, the next section we see on page 13, patient protections. Again, something that might be of interest for our clients, so we want to look through these different sections, parts, fairly carefully. Sometimes, as you'll see on page 14, the source will appear under the subpart. So it's not the part, it's not the section, it's sort of in between there. Subpart D of part 2590 has a totally different, has a somewhat different source. I shouldn't say totally, because it has some of the same source back in April 62 FR 16941 on 1997, unless otherwise noted, and then it shows you how it was redesignated. So you would want to track those down, and then looking on page 15. So now we're looking on pages 14 and 15 at that section we identified on Lexis having to do with preemption, 2590.731, and at the end of that section 2590.731, we see another source designation, again, a different date. And actually, would somebody write down that first date, because we will come back to it. So that's what, 69 FR 78778. Is that right? Somebody writing that down for us? Thank you. And the date also is important. As I mentioned with the Federal Register, you use the date as much as you use the site, December 30, 2004. And you can actually see, like we saw in the credits, we see semicolon, and that means and amended by, thank you. So we see that this started in the Federal Register in 2004 and was amended by a little bit later in 2005, and semicolon once again and amended by in 2014 with the Federal Register sites and the dates. Questions? So let's see how all of this appears on Lexis and Westlaw, because it is somewhat different. So here we have a different section up on Westlaw. And Westlaw calls it credits, just like they call the public law source and the chapter law source credits in statute. So it calls the Federal Register source credits. And it separates out credits and source. And honestly, I think that's kind of confusing. So the original source is here, and then it continues on. I suspect that they pull that out of the Code of Federal Regulations, because that source appears in the text. I suspect they just transfer that over. But credits and source are pretty much the same thing. And you just want to look carefully at the dates and figure out, all right, it probably started in 1978, and here we see the authority. Again, where in the U.S. Code the agency was authorized to promulgate this regulation. Questions? So back here on Lexis, let's see if I can shortcut us back to a section. So again, at 2510. And notice we actually have a section in our drop-down statutory authority. And just below statute, so again, we're in the U.S. Code, and just below statutory authority, we have the history. Any questions about source and authority? I will be asking you about that both in our workshop later on, as well as when a couple weeks hence when we have our administrative materials assignment. Okay. So of course, what do we have to talk about next? Updating, and updating. So I'm actually going to pull up a different section here. Haven't done that in so long. I don't know about you, I miss it. I'm going to pull up a different section because it brings up some other interesting updating. 90.731. So this is a section we were looking at in print, which is a slightly different section than we've got here on Lexis. So what we have here on Lexis is basically, like we do in the statutes, a currentness statement right up top up front. Except this one's a little more detailed than you might find. So this document current through March 15, 2017, issue of the Federal Register. So a little over a week old. Not bad. Actually, not quite a week old. But then it goes on, and this you won't always find, and this is why I think this is interesting to look at. Pursuant to this particular Federal Register site, all regulations that have a future effective date on or after January 2017 will be delayed for 60 days. So what that's telling us is that pursuant to this particular document in the Federal Register, these regulation effective dates have been delayed. What you may have heard about, saw in the news, is that President Trump has issued an executive order basically delaying the effective date of regulations so we can make sure that the agencies can make sure they all make sense. And apparently this particular section, or at least changes, anything with future effective dates may be affected. We'll be looking at that executive order again either later today or next week. But again, one of our themes, bibliographic awareness, comes in. Read this stuff. It's important because if something is happening now and this effective date has been delayed, you need to know about it. Otherwise, in terms of updating, Lexis, I think is pretty straightforward. Here on Westlaw, so we have our currentness link, as we always do. Westlaw is basically telling us it's current through March 17. So again, quite up to date within a week. I'm going to pull up that other section just to see if we see the same notice. So 2590.731. And interestingly, as we go down, we don't see it up top here. So we basically don't see that on Westlaw. How significant, I mean, that section that we're looking at is already effective. I don't know if there were any changes that are pending to it that might be effective later on, but interesting that Westlaw doesn't give us that notice. And so we don't leave out Bloomberg. Oh, no, we want CFR. Okay, probably do what makes you so frustrated with Bloomberg. I want to do a citation search. And we have a nice currency statement right here through March 20th. Again, we don't have that additional notice about future effective dates. But you do want to be aware of effective dates, as we talked a little bit, I think, in statutes, but also true for regulations. Okay. If we promise to talk a little bit about finding regulations, finding the CFR for free, and I will start that conversation by talking about updating our regulations for free. If you don't have Lexis or Westlaw available, there is actually this fantastic website called eCFR. This link is, again, on our class web links. And you can see it is current as of a few days ago. Actually, slightly more up to date, I think, than what we saw in Lexis and Westlaw. And you can, since you're updating, you already have a section number, so you can navigate to your particular section of interest. Takes a little doing. Although this does give you a nice breakdown of the different parts and subtitles and parts. So if you were interested in 2590, and basically what this site does, as does Lexis and Westlaw, is just incorporate any changes that might have happened, and then it gives you the sources for those various amendments. So the eCFR is good both for updating as well as viewing the most up-to-date version of a particular section. Not especially good for searching, but for that we can go to GovInfo. And again, that's the beta site for our government publishing office. And browsing through, I just went to A to Z and found Code of Federal Regulations. You can see we have various different years. Notice we don't have 2017 here. So again, this is, once again, I keep on saying the same words over, but it is important being aware of what you're looking at and the need to update. And again, our theme of bibliographic awareness. If we go to GovInfo, we are not looking at the 2017, any additions that have been made in 2017. In fact, if you look very carefully, if we look at GovInfo, we are not looking for, depending on what title, beyond January 2016. So we're not only 2.5 months old, we're a year and 2.5 months old. And notice what happens. Titles 1 in the beginning, it says up to date January 1. We scroll down a little bit and we get into higher numbers. It now says April 1. You might remember I pointed out as we passed around Title 29, and this is the most up-to-date we have in print in the library. This says revised as of July 2016, and you'll find slightly higher numbers, again 2016, and the end of the highest numbers of the titles in the 40s, October. The way the CFR is updated, and you can see that's true online as well as in print, is certain titles are updated quarterly. So you can see here, titles 1 are update 1 through 16, January, 17 through 27, April, 28 through 41, July, 42 through 50, October. And nobody's asking you to remember dates and months and all of that. Just understand that the CFR, different titles of the CFR are updated different times of the year. If you're looking Lexis and Westlaw or eCFR, you really don't have to worry about that. But if you are looking at free websites, you should be thinking about that. Or other free websites other than eCFR. Other questions? You can also find the CFR here at FDsys if you like the older version, although don't get too used to it because eventually it will get phased out, but here's the CFR. And I'm guessing most of the other free sites will tend to just to link back to these government sites rather than try to reproduce it on their own, which is fine, but again, be aware of how up-to-date the material is that you are looking at. So look at it and know that if you go to year and all you see is 2016, you need to update. And actually, there's a link to eCFR right here on the side. questions about updating? So you see on our walkthrough handout, I give you a screenshot on page 16 of ECFR. Page 17, the list of sections affected is a publication, and you'll see links to it online still. Actually, GovInfo is telling us, if you go back far enough, it's telling us the LSA, list of section affected, will be online shortly. It is the old way to update, the way we used to have to do way back in the dark ages when we didn't have anything online. It still can be useful in very, very narrow circumstances, but I don't think it's worth spending a lot of time because it's actually kind of involved to figure out how to use. If you ever find best thing I can tell you about the LSA is A, it exists, and B, if you ever do have to use it, it's got instructions right in front on how to use it, and just follow it methodically and carefully. And it is available online if you want to try it there. But I wouldn't. I do this for a living, and I've run into those situations maybe twice, and I've been doing this for over 20 years. So if you don't do this for a living, maybe you will never run into it. Okay. Let's move on to the Federal Register. So what the Federal Register does, as we saw, is the source for the regulations that get promulgated, but it does a whole lot more. It tracks and is the place for some of the documents that are produced in our administrative process that you learned about, Administrative Procedure Act, and all of that. In fact, the Federal Register has a kind of interesting history. I know I said in the first class I'm not going to go into history or theory, but this is a little bit interesting, hopefully. Back, I think it was in the 30s, there was a case, Panama refining case, referred to as the hot oil case. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and I think the Supreme Court issued a decision only for everybody, including the Supreme Court, to realize that the regulation in question had been revoked prior to the case ever being filed. And that's because there was no centralized place for regulations to be published. So I think everybody kind of figured out this wasn't such a great idea. So the Federal Register Act was passed in 1935, which required publication of executive and administrative documents. And then a little bit later in the 40s, as I'm guessing you learned about in admin law, the Administrative Procedure Act was passed to set forth how this whole giving the public the right to participate in this regulatory process and how all of that is supposed to happen and get published. So that's where we get the requirements for notice of proposed rulemaking that we find in one of the documents we find in the Federal Register. So now in the Federal Register, in addition to final regulations, we find that notice of proposed rulemaking. We find the proposed rule as it's initially proposed. We actually find the final rule. In the final rule, as we will see in a moment, we find not only the text of the final rule itself, but we find some background information. We'll also find in the Federal Register some of those executive documents. I keep on promising you we'll talk about executive orders, executive proclamations, some memoranda as well. So let's dive in. Page 18. So anybody who wrote down the source for our CFR section? So what was the date? Okay, and page 18. Everybody see the date? Okay, and what was the volume number? And you'll notice just to the left of the date, we see volume 69. So essentially, we got the source reference from the CFR. We're now looking at the source in the Federal Register. Turning to page 19, basically We see the reference up top to 29 CFR Part 2590. We know our section 2590.731 is part of Part 2590. And then, very important piece of information, next, second handy dandy arrow on the page. On the left, we see the action is a final regulation. If the action was a notice, it would say notice. If the action was proposed regulation, it would say proposed regulation. So you want to take a look at that to make sure you know what it is you're looking at. And depending on why you need to look at the Federal Register, you will want to know what document it is. You'll see the third handy-dandy arrow on the page, the effective date. Remember, we were looking at that notice on Lexis about the effective date. If it's after January 20th, it's on hold, so that's good information to know. But here we know this particular rule, its effective date is back in 2005. And then the last handy-dandy arrow on the page, how good is this for further information contact? Now, granted, this was published back in 2004, 2005, so I'm not sure that Dave Malowski or Amy Turner are still working at the agency, because it's over 10 years ago, but their phone numbers, maybe the phone numbers have changed. But it's worth a try, right? If you wanted to ask questions, you actually have a phone number of a person to ask. Of course, if you're representing a client, be aware you may not want to be divulging client confidential information. Even so much as that your client has whatever particular question you have. So just keep that in mind, but having contact information can be really useful. In the middle column, you'll see I underlined that these days, the Federal Register even gives us the website. Not that you could probably Google it, admittedly, but it tells us how to get to the DOL.gov EBSA, so the agency website. And then we get started with what we talked about earlier, that regulatory history, the background. So the Federal Register tells us how the Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act gives us some background, and then the next paragraph goes on to say, after consideration of all of the comments received. So remember, part of the regulatory process, agency proposes, then it takes comments from the public. So the agency has looked at those comments, apparently, that were received. And then it gives us an overview of how they came to the decision they did on the final regulation. So it talks about some of those decisions. And in the right-hand column, we see these final regulations do not modify significantly the 1997 interim rules, but instead add several clarifications to the general framework. So that may tell us maybe I need to look at the Federal Register in 1997 if I want some more regulatory history, depending on what, again, the language is. Turning to page 20. It gives us a sense pre-existing condition exclusion continues to be defined broadly. Now, that's not our client's issue, even though she had a pre-existing condition. That's not why she was denied coverage. But if you were interested in the pre-existing condition exclusion, interesting to know it's supposed to be defined broadly. So you may want to be arguing, hey, the agency intends to define it broadly, so don't define it so narrowly. Turning to page 21. So on the right-hand bottom, you see the handy-dandy arrow. This is where the actual text of our section finally starts. So you see, just on the bottom of the right-hand column, the section symbol 2590.731, preemption, state flexibility, etc. Look on the top left, and we'll see it's the page of the Federal Register, 78778. Who wrote? Steve, you wrote down the number? Is that that's the same number, right? What a surprise. I'm sure you're all shocked. So you can see what the source, the point of that is you can see what the source does. It points us to actually where the actual final regulation is published. Not the first page where all the information is, so you have to either flip or scroll back a little bit if you're interested in that other background information. And you can just see on page 22 the continuation of the text of our rule as it finishes up. Okay. Any questions about what we see in the Federal Register, the source, reference that got us there. So I mentioned the Federal Register is published just about every day, weekday. And if you wanted to see some of this information, at least for more recent regulations, that's not the right source. You can actually find the Federal Register GPO site, but there's actually, I think, a more interesting site called regulations.gov. So this is probably useful more for regulations that are currently or recently went through the entire process. And this is a free .gov website, so this is free. And so you can actually find basically the file for different regulations. So if we were interested in, see what's trending here. So this fiduciary rule has been in the news. And that was a proposed rule that was put on hold. So we could see what its status is. So this is a regulation tracking, and we get actually some of the Federal Register information. And notice the action proposed rules, so this isn't final. We might want to see the docket folder and what the docket folder does in addition to giving us the proposed rule. It gives us supporting documents, and we can actually see comments. These are actually, you can comment for rules that comment period is still open. You can go on regulations.gov and put in your comment. And you can see some 3,445 people did so for this particular proposed rule. And if you wanted to view those comments, you could do that as well. And you can look at not just what's trending here, but rules that have already been posted. If you wanted to look at final rules, again, you're all very adept at utilizing filters. Notice that these rules, most of the rules are assigned a number. This RIN number is a good way to track a specific rule if you need to do so. And for those of you who wind up in areas that are regulatory areas, securities is one, environment's another, obviously air travel is another we're looking at now. Knowing about that RIN number may be useful. And again, same thing, you can open up the docket folder and see comments and other documents associated with the rulemaking process. Questions on regulations.gov, and that's pictured on page 23 of your handout. Okay, let's take a break and come back at 5:40. I neglected first in our show and tell. Sent around the Code of Federal Regulations, but I didn't send around the issue of Federal Register. Shame on me. This is from October of 2016, just so you can see what it looks like in print. The other item, actually, I didn't mention, had to do with housekeeping, and that is because we did the class last week, we didn't get to finish our cases workshop. Since you are now working on the cases assignment, it seems to be rather redundant. So if you want me to look at what you've done, give it to me. If you're not particularly concerned, that's okay too. I'm just going to call that an act of nature and we'll call it a wash. So let's now dive back into administrative materials. So we've looked very in depth at regulations, so where they appear, subject arrangement in a code, up to date. In the CFR, we looked at the regulatory history that happens in the Federal Register that in print is making its way around the room. We looked at how to update the CFR, either Lexis Westlaw or eCFR. And we took a look at how to do some regulation tracking. So looking into the future on regulations.gov. What's going on with regulations that have been proposed but are in the middle of the process, or maybe have been recently promulgated and we want to see some of the comments and associated documents. Let's now move on to another type of administrative material, and that is agency decisions and guidance. And I am fairly sure I will make the mistake at least once, if not multiple times, in just using the term agency decisions to mean both. They are different types of materials, different types of documents. My excuse is that you tend to find them in the same places, and I am not the only one who tends to lump them together. I shall try not to make that mistake, but if I do and you're confused, please ask me to clarify. So, of course, agency decisions, as we already discussed, these quasi-judicial decisions. So you have in the various agencies people who sit as administrative law judges and decide disputes brought to that particular agency by an interested party who wants the agency to interpret a rule differently, apply a rule differently. And then the administrative law judge will write these decisions. You will want to see if these decisions exist for any particular issue. Obviously, for precedential value, they have precedential value within the agency, but a court is not bound. And I should say, with the exception of, and I'm sure you talked about this in admin, and I am going to be very general about this, but within the Chevron decision, you might remember, where courts will defer to agency interpretations up to a point. So the decision itself isn't a rule the way, or a holding in a case the way you look at a holding in a case, but it does have some weight. Okay. You will find sometimes in the CFR procedures within an agency's rules on how a person should pursue these particular administrative decisions. We actually saw in the CFR section we were looking at that there are rules set forth within the Department of Labor for appeals regarding benefits decisions. So if you are in that process, you will want to check the CFR to see what rules apply. There are also general rules within the Administrative Procedure Act on how this process should happen. And once a process goes through and does go to an administrative law judge, if somebody doesn't like the ruling, which is probably going to be one side or the other, right, how they would then appeal that administrative ruling to a court and have that work through the judicial process. Finding these agency decisions and guidance, and I will talk about guidance separately, but finding them both can be tricky, and actually in the old days really difficult. A lot easier now with the web. You can actually just try Googling. We'll get a little more sophisticated. But just to give you a sense of the scope of the challenge, here is a organization chart of the government with the various different agencies. And most of them, I won't say all, but many of them anyway, issue decisions and or guidance. So again, probably the best place to find these decisions these days is online. And again, Google would be one place and not a bad way to start. We've all talked about how to do that, as well as remember the site search. Sometimes that's useful. One place to shortcut that, if you remember it exists, and the link is again on the course web links, is this guide from the University of Virginia Library, Administrative Decisions. And this, actually, they do include guidance in this. So there's an example where I'm not the only one who pulls them together. So if we were interested in the Department of Labor, I'm actually going to jump down this way. It's a little easier. Nope, I went too far. Let's just do it the old-fashioned way and scroll. So there's the Labor Department. I would have got there eventually. So you see various different subdivisions within the Department of Labor, and I could take a look and make my guess best. We run into this agency before, Employee Benefit Security Administration. We see ERISA advisory opinions. And we've been at the EBSA website before. What I might want to do is to try a site search. And remember, our Google site search is a little bit difficult to see because of our... There we go. So again, remember SIT : and I'm just going to go to the end. If I want to search all of the EBSA, I might search for decisions or opinions. I could add to my search particular terms like preemption. Excuse me. So probably for me, that would be the first place I would go would be that Virginia website of agency decisions. And I don't have the link handy, I would Google Virginia agency decisions, and it's going to be one of the first couple of links that comes up. These decisions are also available on Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg, but on a fairly hit or miss basis. And this is one reason why I went into some detail when we first started today and we did our search. And here on Westlaw, we were looking at the CFR and under regulations. You could also find state regulations there, but this other filter, administrative decisions and guidance, Westlaw very correctly spells out both types of documents. And then what you may or may not want to do based on, and again, this is a keyword search, is you may want to narrow the filter. You can narrow by agency. For instance, if you're not interested in New York tax, actually you might want to get rid of New York altogether in your search. But however you choose to use the filters, you may want to narrow that way. But as I said, they're very hit or miss. They're hit or miss by agency, they're hit or miss by time period. And there really is no really good, thorough, methodical way to make sure you've looked at every single agency decision. Not necessary, really. This is something where you want to see, has the agency said anything about this? Because if they have, then this is going to be a very good argument for me to say to a court, to an agency, wherever you are in whatever process you're in, hey, look, agency said this 10 years ago. We want you to say the same thing. Another place to find decisions on agency decisions online, and a little less, well, more hit or miss in terms of coverage, but less hit or miss in terms of narrowing to a particular subject. And I didn't talk about this earlier, so it's a good time to talk about it now, and that is the Code of Federal Regulations that got passed around. This is just the text of the regulations. This is not an annotated code. You just, in print, you just get the regulations. The only place an annotated code of federal regulations exists is online on Lexis, Westlaw, and to a much lesser extent, as we will see, Bloomberg. And what you will see, so in this particular section we have up, 731, there are no notes of decisions. But other sections will have them, and it works just like notes of decisions does in our favorite annotated code, if they're there. The other place, so that's cases. The notes of decisions sometimes will also reference administrative decisions. I don't know why the publisher, in this case West, how they decide when to include administrative decisions and notes of decisions or not, but once in a while you'll find them there. You will find them more reliably on Westlaw in citing references. And you see it there. There's no difficulty or really magic to it. So Westlaw has 5 of them that pertain to the particular section of the CFR we're looking at here, in this case, 731. Everybody clear on notes of decisions and citing references for regulations? Notes of decisions will give us cases. Citing references basically will give us citing references wherever they are. So maybe it may be. So citing references, not surprisingly, does not list cases because there are no notes of decisions. So apparently there are no citing cases, but there is a citing secondary source as well as administrative decision and other regulations. Just out of curiosity, if you bear with me, let's try 5, 10. Make sure I get the number right here. There it is. Oh, no, let's try a different one. Just so I can show you an example, assuming I have it correct. Yeah, no, this one doesn't have notes of decisions either. Okay. And likewise, on Lexis, see if they have any. So Lexis also doesn't appear to have any case notes or notes of decisions for this particular section, but that's where you would find it, is find notes of decisions for cases. And again, within the case notes or notes of decisions, Lexis may cite to some administrative agency decisions for Lexis, since Lexis doesn't have an equivalent to citing decisions. The other way to find administrative decisions, which is how we started out earlier. Let's see, no, that's not still there. Is essentially using the filters after a keyword search, as we pointed out earlier. We have administrative codes and regulations. And then we have the separate category for administrative materials. So just to sum up, Westlaw, notes of decisions for cases, possibly agency decisions, citing references, hopefully for agency decisions, as well as doing a keyword search and using the filter. Lexis, pretty much keyword search during the filter. If you're looking for cases that cite to a particular regulation, see if there are any case notes. And as we saw with the Code of Federal Regulations in a couple of sections that we checked, there were no cases notes of decisions, so that is not unusual. Back in the old days, before we could go online and search agency websites, the main place to find a lot of these agency decisions were loose leaves. Now, I keep on referring to loose leaves. These are the specialized secondary sources. We will actually talk about them in more depth next time. But to the extent that we find loose leaves online, so we took a look at actually a couple back. Remember when you were looking at CCH and had to struggle with getting online on CCH from the website? CCH is one source of loose leaves, and that would be so a loose leaf on your particular topic, whether it's tax or labor or the various other loose leaves or really secondary sources that CCH has online, you would find a lot of these regulatory materials overall. And again, we'll talk more about that next time. You will notice, actually, so within Lexis and Westlaw, we're looking at these administrative materials. You'll find these decisions, you'll find guidance. I mean, Westlaw spells it out that you find guidance, but once you're in the results, the best you can try to do is use the filters either by agency or jurisdiction to see what you find. Really, if I'm looking specifically for guidance, that is, I'm looking for the agency telling me, here's how you should apply our rules prospectively. In other words, moving forward, not here's an issue at where two parties are disagreeing and we're just going to resolve those two parties' disagreements. That would be an agency decision. If you're looking for guidance, I probably really wouldn't look on Lexis and Westlaw because it's mixed in with everything else and difficult to pull out. The guidance, as we saw, would be more with the department agent, with the website. So let's guidance. And you can see right up top, Department of Labor Guidance Agenda. So this is the best answer I've found, with the one caveat I would probably also try guidelines. Again, as great as Google is, its computers are still kind of stupid, so they don't realize guidance and guidelines may be the same thing, and we want to see both. And this guidance can be really critical if you are representing a client, perhaps your client that you are working on as you do the different assignments, who wants to create a product, bottled tea. You might want to see if an agency, either New York or federal, has some guidance on what has to happen moving forward, because she's not in a dispute yet. We're hopefully trying to avoid that. She wants to make something. So if there's guidance on there on advertising or labeling, that would be really useful, right? So worth checking out to see what you can find. Any questions? Oh, and on the handout, I give you a printout of the Virginia website with the federal administrative decisions. Any questions on agencies? And I kind of mixed in notes of decisions and finding cases in there as well. Okay. Let's try to make some sense of this and put this together with a workshop. I will distribute this hopefully we'll have time to finish it today. And as I said, we will continue next week with executive materials and state administrative materials. So on this workshop, I will ask you to stop after question 15, because we haven't talked about 16 through 18 yet. And what you will see on the first question is I'm asking you to go to federalregister.gov. And let me get there now so you can, there we go, I have it already there. And I'm asking you to find the 2016 issue of the Federal Register for the same date as your birthday. If you don't see that date, find the closest date. So obviously if your birthday was a weekend, find a date on either side. It doesn't really matter where. To find a date on the Federal Register, if you go to Browse and you go to Dates, you'll see a calendar here. So go back to 2016. Or actually, you can just go to a specific date if you want to try that. Either way. So it's not as clearly stated in the question number 1 as I've showed you, so now you see. And if you have any other questions, I threw at you a whole lot of stuff, a lot of information today, I realize. So if you have any questions, I'll be wanting